This begins week 2 of our adult Sunday school class topic, Celebrating Lent. Now, if you know even a little bit about Lent, you're probably wondering, why are those two words going together? The last thing you would tend to think about Lent is celebration. And some of you may be so unfamiliar with the practice, you might think, is this even something I want to participate in? Celebrating Lent has to do with the 40 days prior to Easter that begins with Ash Wednesday. Now, our practice is not to put ashes on the forehead, but in the Roman Church, that was the practice and continues to be the practice that begins Lent season. And it's a time during Lent where fasting and prayer and reflection takes place in preparation for the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, should Christians, particularly Protestants and evangelicals, should we practice Lent, and what is the meaning for us today? Just a little history that might be helpful for you to know. The first time we read any writings that reflect on the practice of festivals, fast and feast in the Christian church is Athanasius from Africa, Alexandria. And he began to write about the importance of how Christians celebrate and form practices similar to what we read about in the Old Testament practices. In the Old Testament, there was 3 major pilgrimages, festivals and pilgrimage: the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of the Passover, and Pentecost. And in the early church, you still read in the book of Acts, these practices were followed because they were actually outreach opportunities as Jews on pilgrimage would come to Jerusalem, and those believers would share the true meaning of each of these festivals and how Christ is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament practices. But as the church moved into the Roman Empire, they moved into a more secular context. Rome was filled with festivals, but those festivals were festivals to their gods, and they were embedded in the idea of how can they highlight their identity and their narrative as Romans. You see the festival of the Colosseum, which many elites, nobles, would celebrate many festivals during the course of the year. What began to emerge in the church was that we need our own festivals to teach the people the importance of what Jesus has done. And those 2 main festivals are centered on Christmas and on Easter. Christmas, the festival was called Advent, and then for Easter, the festival leading up to Easter was called Lent. Maybe you've read that in the Reformation, many of our Reformation leaders did not embrace the practices of Rome in the area of Lent. John Calvin wrote extensively that these practices of detailed fasting were superstitious, and they gave the priesthood an inordinate amount of control over the practices of the people. Zwingli wrote of the scriptures being free, and they free us from limits on certain diets or even certain kind of rigid regiments that cause us to not celebrate the finished work of Jesus Christ. Just in summary, their cautions were that since Jesus has already suffered for us, he's fasted in the wilderness, his work is sufficient and sets our standing before God based on what he's done, not based on what we've done. They also cautioned about man-centered religion and the creep, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, where meaningless repetition can lead to man-centered religion, where we're trying to present ourselves as acceptable before God. And also, there was the concern that we would place fasting as more important in our life than the Scriptures give us. The Scriptures never the New Testament never command us to fast, but say that this can be part of our spiritual journey. So it is important that we think through formative practices, but we need to make sure that we don't make certain practices necessary in a way that will be misleading. So why are we practicing and studying Lent? We're doing this all adult classes because we want to be an intergenerational church. We want to study the same thing together. We also want to ask, what should we be doing to prepare ourselves by way of spiritual journey as we prepare for Holy Week and Easter? We're using this book by N.T. Wright called Lent for Everyone. It's a study through the book of Matthew. And last week, Dr. McCurd taught on Matthew chapters 10 through 13. And this week, we'll reflect later in this study, we'll reflect on chapters 14 through 18. Next week, Pastor Naide will pick up from there and teach that section, and then John Barrett will teach the last section. And Dr. McCurd reminded us that we are on a kingdom journey, and we're called to believe and expect that God is at work destroying the works of the devil and showing his power in salvation and the bestowal of the forgiveness of sins. So those who do practice Lent can recognize that along the way, on the journey, it's easy to gather barnacles. Now, if you see this picture of a ship, sailboat, you see the bottom of it has quite a bit of seaweed, and that seaweed's attached because barnacles, some sea creatures, are attached to the bottom of the hull. Along the way, those sea creatures will eat through the paint and leave the metal to rust or the wood to decay. Not only does this slow down the progress of the ship, it eventually eats away at the bottom of the hull. Well, reality is, living in this world, we can find ourselves being held back, slowed down, or even off course due to the sinful practices. As Apostle John says, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life are not from the Father, but they're from the world. And so during Lent, we're seeking to become desensitized to the things of this world. And we're seeking to become more sensitive to the things of the Spirit, particularly of God's kingdom. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches how hard it is for us to know the conditions of our heart, those invisible places that are made to meet God, but all too often we can store up treasures in our hearts that are destructive, much like those barnacles. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, or thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust cannot destroy, and thieves cannot break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So he says that we can look at what we treasure and what we're storing up and determine if our hearts are growing stronger in the kingdom or if our hearts are becoming weaker or insensitive to the things of God. Also, in the end of Matthew 7, Jesus uses the story of two people building a house, one on sand and one on solid rock. And he says that when the storms and the winds blow, these formative practices are revealed. Are your foundations hearing God's word and putting them into practice, or is your foundations a man-centered approach to life? And so it's important to think through your formative practices and to ask the question, has my heart attached itself to destructive practices? So during this first time, first section, we're going to discuss two questions, and we're discussing the question about barnacles in our heart. It's what barnacles attach themselves to those that are in your life stage, and how do you see this negatively impacting your spiritual pursuit? That's question number one. And question number 2 is, why is it so difficult to identify the encumbrances and the sins that so easily entangle us? And that phrase there is out of Hebrews chapter 12. Some sinful practices definitely entangle us, but some encumbrances weigh us down and slow us down on this journey of kingdom living. When we return from discussion, we're going to talk about how in Matthew 14 through 18, Jesus says in his teaching his disciples that faith is the path of the kingdom journey. So if someone can hit pause on this presentation, take time and discuss those 2 questions now. In week 2, Matthew 14 through 18, Jesus is teaching not just about the kingdom, but he's teaching about the path of the kingdom, and that faith is the pathway of the kingdom. When I got to college, my first year, after all the physicals that each player had to go through, and after being evaluated, the head trainer of my team told me, "You'll never make the field here, and you'll never play a play." Now that picture is proof that he was wrong, because just a few years later I was the starting receiver. But he said you'll never make the field because he said that you're out of balance in your muscle development. And they use these tools to evaluate your muscle development. I was overdeveloped in the lower half of my body, my legs, and I was underdeveloped in the upper half. Now I was a wide receiver, and I played point guard in basketball, and I played middle infield in baseball. And so at that time, there wasn't a great emphasis on wide receivers or point guards working to overdevelop their upper body. But he said, you're not going to be able to perform because you're out of balance. He said that if you don't get busy on developing your upper body, you'll not be strong enough to make the field. Now, that was true when I first began my college experience, but it's true now. I've got to be developing my muscles or they atrophy. You know, faith is a muscle. It's a spiritual muscle that has to be developed. And if it's not developed, you atrophy. But that principle in my life is true with all of our lives. All too often, we focus on the things that we're comfortable with. For me, it was working on my lower body and not my upper body. And we tend to shy away from those areas that are challenging to us. That's just the opposite of how Jesus develops our faith. Jesus puts us in situations that are more challenging and more stretching to cause us to take our eyes off of ourselves and to place our eyes on Him. Now, what you find in Matthew 14 through 18 is the whole section here is focused on developing your faith for the kingdom journey. And a stark verse that ends Matthew 13, at the end of Matthew 13, Jesus has returned to Nazareth. And the last verse says that He could do no miracles in Nazareth, no mighty works, because of their unbelief. So from that point on, Jesus begins to focus on developing the faith of His disciples. And you'll notice in chapter 14, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then Jesus sends the disciples off in a boat and meets them in the storm and calls to Peter, who, you recall, walks on the water. In Matthew 14, the disciples' response when they see Jesus, it says they were terrified. And then Jesus says, "Take heart, do not be afraid." It says they were terrified and they cried out with fear. It's contrasting this idea that you're still living this kingdom journey in your own strength and you're terrified. But if you're going to make progress in the spiritual journey, you're going to have to learn to live by faith. Another stark reference is The Canaanite woman, which is Luke chapter 15. This woman, we're told in verse 22, is crying out, trying to get to Jesus, and the disciples are keeping her from Jesus. And she's crying out in desperation, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." And she's fighting to get to Jesus just to get her message. And the disciples are a barrier, and they're barnacles, and they're keeping her from Jesus. Jesus not only speaks to her, but after he listens to her request, he says, "Your faith is great." In another gospel it says, "I've seen no faith as great in Israel as this woman's faith." She's commended for her faith. And then in chapter 17, the disciples are corrected because of their weakness or the faultiness of their faith. Jesus comes down from the mountain after the Mount of Transfiguration, and there's those that tell him that they brought someone, a young boy who was in need of healing. They brought them to the disciples, and we're told the disciples offered him nothing. They were unable to heal him. And Jesus says, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I with you? How long must I bear you?" He's saying that you've not learned anything in the feeding of the 5,000. You've not learned anything in my sovereign power over the elements and coming to you in the storms. You've not learned anything in my healing of this child from this Canaanite woman. And the recognition is that faith is a spiritual muscle, and it has to be used or it atrophies. And all too often, like me, we tend to exercise faith in the areas that we feel that we're strong in the places that we feel we are competent. And yet, God's plan often is to put difficulties, winds, storms in our pathways to cause us not to look at ourselves, but to look to Him. When Jesus calls Peter out of the boat, Matthew acknowledges that as long as Peter's eyes are on Jesus, he is walking by faith. But when he looks around and he sees the storms, he begins to sink, and Jesus has to rescue him. So it too is with us, that if we're going to grow in the spiritual journey, we are going to have to learn to live by faith. So here's a couple of discussion questions in regards to faith. First question is, how do you keep from either not longing for Jesus to do mighty works or being unable to sense them because your faith has atrophied? Some of you have stopped asking God for big things and longing to see God do mighty things. You just settled in. How do we keep from becoming cynical and from just giving up in terms of our pursuit of living by faith? And then also that question says, what about if we've been unable to sense that spiritual reality around us because we've atrophied? The second question is, how do we hold one another accountable to live by faith? Is it possible to hold one another accountable to be a community that lives by faith? When you finish this discussion, your class leader will direct and close our time today.